Okay, in this video, we're going to learn about strategies for defeating your opponent's definitions. You see, sometimes both debaters in a round will present definitions. The affirmative will present definitions of the sides. The negative will present definitions of the sides. Most of the time, these definitions agree with each other, but there will be some instances where they're drastically different. I remember when I was at my first tournament, another debater presented definitions that were drastically different than mine, and they actually defined my whole case out of the round. So I was on the side of equity. This was a resolution of freedom versus equity, and you don't have to worry about what that means, but basically what happened was he redefined equity, my side, so that my case was no longer upholding equity. What I was talking about equity was different than what he was talking about, and it made a problem because my case no longer made sense under his definitions. So in those situations, sometimes you need to attack your opponent's definitions and show why your definitions are better than his in order to show that your case still stands. And this can also be a strategy. Maybe under your definitions, your opponent's case no longer makes sense. Then you can also attack your opponent's definitions, show why your definitions are better, then use your definitions to kind of show how your opponent isn't really upholding his side of the resolution. Maybe you have a different definition of fair trade than he does, and with your definition of fair trade, his side isn't actually upholding fair trade if he's on the fair trade side. So it's important to have these, be able to defend your definitions. A word of warning here, though, don't be too quick to defeat the definitions. There's a stereotype in Lincoln Douglas debate now where there's these definition debates where people are arguing over little nitty-gritty things in the definitions that really don't matter, and it makes people really annoyed when you're arguing about the definitions and they don't matter. So if your opponent presents another definition of something and it's very similar to yours, or it's so close it doesn't matter, or you don't think it'll hurt you in any way, then just leave it alone, okay? So only replace the definitions, only try to argue against your opponent's definitions if you really need to. That said, there are three ways you can replace your opponent's definitions. And when I say replace, I mean we have to choose one standard definition that everybody goes by in the round. So you can't have your definitions for your side and your opponent uses different definitions on his side. In order for everyone to be clear about what we're debating about, there has to be one universal set of definitions for the round. So it's either your definitions or your opponent's definitions. So when I say replacing your opponent's definitions, I mean you don't use his and you use yours. Three ways to do that. One, credible source. Credible source. You can argue that your definitions are from a more credible source than your opponent's is. Maybe you got your definitions from, say, Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, right? A very popular dictionary. He got his definitions, he wrote them himself. Your definitions are probably more credible because Merriam-Webster is probably better at making definitions than your opponent is. Or even between dictionaries, Merriam-Webster versus some other dictionary you never heard of, Merriam-Webster probably wins. If you have the Merriam-Webster definitions, you can say, my definitions are better, they have a more credible source. Let's use my definitions. And then, attack your opponent or defend yourself using the definitions. Second, you can say real-world usage. Real-world usage, real-world usage, meaning my definitions are more accurately reflect how these terms play out in the real world. They more accurately reflect how we use them in everyday life. So say that your opponent has some weird definition of free trade or this weird definition, and you have a definition of free trade that makes more sense, and it's what everybody typically agrees outside a debate round that's what free trade is. So I don't know what the opponent's definition would be, but it's something weird, and you have a standard definition everybody normally agrees with in everyday life. It's more common sense. Then you could say, my definition better reflects how this word is used in the real world, even outside of debates, just in everyday life, normal conversation. My definition is more accurately reflective of that, so my definition should win. That's also another justification. Another justification is, my definitions are more fair. They're more fair. And we talked about this a little when we were writing the case. You want to have fair definitions that you can be able to use for both sides. So, for example, if you're debating the debate of nationalism versus globalism, that resolution, you don't want to define the globalism side defines nationalism as nationalism is this philosophy made by Hitler and it advocates killing everybody and doing everything we want for our nation and genocide and all that stuff. That's not a fair definition. That's very unreasonable. It's abusive to the side of nationalism because the nationalism guy is going to be like, you just said that my side is killing people, and that's not true. He's not going to like that. So you need to have a fair definition, a reasonable definition, because nationalism doesn't mean genocide or killing a bunch of people. It just means protecting the interests of your country. So if you have a definition saying, his definition is saying nationalism is killing everyone, my definition is just saying nationalism is protecting the interests of my country, my definition is more fair and reasonable. It's not abusive to either side, so we should use my definition. Those are the three main ways you can replace the definitions in a round. Finally, one last trick. One cool way to replace your definitions also, have three definitions that say the same thing. So what do I mean by that? Say your opponent presents this definition of fair trade, right? He says, this is my definition of fair trade. It's different from your definition of fair trade. But you have three definitions of fair trade that support your point, that support your position. So you have three of them that say the same thing, right? Which is what you want it to say. You have three definitions that say what you want to say under fair trade. He only has one. You say, Judge, he only has one definition for his point of view. I have three definitions that support my point of view. So three definitions versus one. So all the dictionaries seem to agree with me. We should go with my position and use one of these three definitions, not my opponent's one definition, which says something different. So get like three or so definitions that all say the same thing, which support your position, and then that's another cool tactic that you can use in a definition debate. So hopefully that prepares you for any definition debates you run into. But again, try not to get into definition debates if you don't have to, because they get really hairy, and sometimes they end up not mattering because you're debating over this one word and it doesn't even matter. If it doesn't even matter and it doesn't impact the round, and the rest of the arguments in the round won't be affected either way, just let it go. If you realize that it won't hurt you in any way and that it doesn't matter, just let it go. So that's my advice to you.